Thank you and welcome. This is a very special event, and I'm glad to see that so many of you have taken the time and trouble to be here. You're all very welcome. We will try and run this by the rules of the Oxford Debating Union. We've been extraordinarily well coached, and unfortunately a bit like a crossbred dog being trained by a racehouse trainer. We may not be quite as good as the quality of the training that we've received. However, the first rule of the Oxford Debating Union is telephones and laptops and other things all turned off, please. Even the turn off situation that prevents us from hearing when an email or a text message has arrived, please.
No buzzing.
No buzzing. Thank you very much. We have 4 volunteer speakers, and the format of the debate will be that we will have first a speaker for the motion, followed by a speaker against. They'll each have 10 minutes, following which, if members of the congregation would care to raise a question or make a point briefly, please, that will be possible. We will then have a second speaker in favour of the motion, followed by a second speaker against the motion, following which there'll be a division. And we'll be asking you then, please, to leave your seats and walk to the side of the House to which you wish to cast your vote. In case of... No, I won't go into any of the contingency planning at the moment. There is a House rule about not using names, and it's customary in the Oxford debating community to talk about the honourable member of such and such a college. Which is not terribly distinctive, seeing that we're all, with one exception, I think, members of the same college. So it's not a terribly helpful identifier, is it? So I will introduce but nevertheless, we're not allowed to use personal names. And the speakers have been, as I said, extraordinarily well briefed, and I think the essence of a good debate is respect. So they can make the points as vehemently as they wish, but it should not be personal or aggressive or disrespectful in any way. I recognise that there are many people here whose first language is not English, and I know what that means to be following verbal battle in a language which is not your first language. So I hope that we will all be terribly deferential and respectful to those people, including eliminating background noise of chit-chat and such like. So if that sounds a draconian regime, I'm afraid that's the way it is. So, first of all, the motion, we're debating the principal motion that this House believes that in the next 15 years, large organisations, as we know them, will no longer exist. That's what you're being asked to vote on at the end of the debate. There's a little bit more descriptive information in the debate proposition that's been circulated, and I'll read that out for the sake of completeness. External and internal forces such as technology, demographics, globalization, and other factors will, quote, explode, unquote, organizations, splintering them into myriad forms and shapes and into individual free agents with various allegiances. Chaos will rule the organizational day. The speakers on this subject then are, and I mustn't name them, first of all the Honourable Member of Green Templeton from Brussels. That'll be followed by the Honourable Member of Green Templeton from Switzerland. That will be followed by the Honourable Member of Green Templeton from Singapore, followed by, finally, the Honourable Member of Green Templeton from Pittsburgh. Ladies and gentlemen, your first speaker is the Honourable Member of Green Templeton from Brussels.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Honourable Member for Brussels understands that the large organisations you may like to see no longer in existence are the European institutions, although that could be the subject of another debate. But first, a word on chaos. Do we think that today chaos does not reign within our organisational world? Hang on a minute. How did fabulous Fabrice Tour manage to get away with, in his own words, selling toxic mortgage bonds to widows and orphans that he ran into at the airport? He also referred to the financial products he created as pure intellectual masturbation. In another email, he wrote, "The whole building is about to collapse any time now." He added, "Only potential survivor, the fabulous Fab, standing in the middle of all these complex, highly leveraged, exotic trades he created without necessarily understanding all the implications of those monstrosities." This is a drop in the ocean of what went on and what continues to go on in the financial industry. And why will it go on? Because there is no incentive to change. All the promises of financial reform which were made back in 2008 have come to nothing, or been so watered down that they have no teeth whatsoever. So guess what? Within now and 15 years, there will be an even bigger crash. This time, the powers that be plastered over the cracks. So it looks as though we have stability, but we do not. Do not forget, my friends, that the crash in the financial sector led to a stock market crash. And governments, together with the large amorphous organisations that underpin and feed off them, are not on the brink of bankruptcy. They are well bankrupt. We just don't call it that. And if we look at the enormous publicity surrounding the Greek debt just a couple of years ago, when they had a deficit of just $27, $28 billion. Consider how graphically clever the US is when it talks about coming back from the fiscal cliff. Hang on. They had a deficit at that time of well over $780 billion. It's now over $900 billion. And it's not the only one that's increasing. The point I'm making here, my friends, is that we are not living in a stable world right now. So this is one of the reasons I believe that 15 years from now, these large self-serving organizations will no longer exist as they are today. In fact, we are seeing the change already, with banks being set up by cooperatives, like Newbie in Belgium. Even old financial institutions are trying to wash off the bad smell by changing their name. So Dexia became Belfius. This is what their ad agency came up with to make it more people-friendly. Belgium, finance for us, Bel, fee, us. Citibank became Biobank, whatever's behind that name. And communities in the UK, tired of the greedy and violent payday loan sharks, are setting up community lending programs which provide unsecured loans in an unregulated but more trusting environment. In Germany, we now have what is called mini jobs, which provide low-paid employment with no benefits to make companies more competitive and to lower official unemployment levels. In the UK, we have 0-hour contracts. What's all that about? They employ you, but they don't have to give you any work, and they don't have to pay you. More and more companies are outsourcing, not just manufacturing, call centres, but all service centres. Eventually, there will be no longer any intrinsic value within large organisational structures. Intrinsic value, my friends, innovation, employee engagement, customer loyalty, management commitment, integrity, and I could go on. I put it to you that 15 years from now, there will be no cohesive force keeping organisations together. Let's look at food distribution. We've all heard of the horse meat scandal. Nothing much has changed there either. 1/3 of pig farmers in France have gone out of business because of being squeezed by the food distribution companies. And yet in Alsace, in France, pork and poultry farming is on the increase by individual farmers using pig and poultry-friendly techniques, butchering and refining their own products, better products for less money than the big conglomerates and supermarket chains would have us pay. And apologies for the vegetarians amongst us. And it's not just in Alsace, but also in Australia that things are changing, where small is beautiful. Aborigines are increasingly becoming owners of their own businesses, supporting big mining companies like Rio Tinto, and in some cases actually exploiting mines in their territories in partnerships with these companies. This is a far cry from them being paid to get drunk so that their land can be exploited by international conglomerates. The point is that the current structure, objectives, processes, and frankly, misguided leadership in large organisations today is unsustainable. The increasing transparency brought about by a combination of technology and whistleblowers, the pressure of demographic change, and the constant ebb and flow of the global economy will force a paradigm shift in the way business is done, and will inevitably result in the end of large organisations as we know them today. Rest in peace.
I call upon the Honourable Member of Green Templeton College and the constituency of Switzerland to speak against the motion.
Thank you, Chair. And before I start, based on Chris McKenna's talk this morning, I would like to thank the Honourable Member of Pittsburgh for increasing the status of this team. So, why are we all here today? Why did we all choose to do a Masters? And why did we choose to do it with HAC and Oxford rather than some online small group somewhere? The answers to those three questions will shed light on why we believe that organisations, large organisations, will continue to exist long after everyone in this room no longer does. So let's look at three interconnected areas which indicate why this is so. They are the three N's of needs, nature, and nurture. We as human beings have two fundamental needs. We have the need to belong and the need to achieve. And those two needs reflect two basic fears: the fear of rejection and the fear of failure. And it's these fears which are sparked when change occurs in large organisations, because people are afraid that they will be rejected and that they will also not succeed. So the need to belong and the need to achieve are fundamental needs that we have as human beings. When we were writing our book recently, we interviewed a lady called Sarah Matthew, who is CEO and chairman of Dun & Bradstreet. And Sarah said, a very ambitious lady, she wouldn't be chairman and CEO of Dun & Bradstreet if she wasn't, and she said she set herself a goal in life to be CFO of a privately quoted company by the time she was 45. And at 44 years of age, she was in Procter & Gamble and the CFO was 47. So she realised it wasn't going to happen there. And she got a phone call from a headhunter who said that Dun & Bradstreet need a CFO. She's like, great, got my goal. So she moved to Dun & Bradstreet and within a few months discovered a massive problem with the books. Could be an Enron type thing, maybe not, but they had to investigate. And the CEO came to her and he said, Sarah, how long is it going to take to go back over the books for the last 10 years? And Sarah said in her mind, she thought, how the heck do I know? I've never done this before. But she said, 6 weeks, give me 6 weeks. And she went back and she and her team worked night and day for 6 weeks to deliver the results. At the end of the 6 weeks, they came back, restated the books, no fraudulent activity, share price goes back up, board is happy, CEO is happy, she is walking on air. She is, I am a goddess. They have made the right decision. I am a god here. 2 months later, the CEO calls her into his office and he says, Sarah, we have a problem. And Sarah says, what do you mean we have a problem? He said, we've just had the employee engagement results back and yours are the lowest by far. And Sarah said, do you want great results or do you want happy people? And the CEO said, I want both, and so should you if you're a leader. And Sarah's pissed. And she says, well, I guess I'm not a leader then, in a rather petulant way. And the CEO says, you're right, you're not. But you could be. You have to work the people side. And so she said she drove home, screaming and yelling, kicking the cat when she got home, and was like, wow. But then she decided, if I do want to get further, if I want to grow and learn as a person, I need to learn this side. And so it's these two legs, the leg of being, belonging, and the leg of doing, achieving, that makes people motivated and successful. It's this combination. So let's move to nature. Living organisms. Living organisms make up organizations. And all living organizations grow. A living organism is either growing or it's decaying. There is no static state. And so living organisms naturally grow. You put an acorn in the ground, it becomes an oak tree. You'd have an embryo, it becomes a grown adult. In fact, we did hear from Chris McKenna that in the Netherlands, they're getting even bigger with time. The growth is greater. There's no limits to the growth. The potential for growth gets huger. And it's the same with organisations. Organisations start with 1 or 2 people. They become successful. They attract more people. People want to belong. And they want to achieve. And they have success. And they achieve more. And they grow bigger. And through growing bigger, people then trust them more. They have a brand. And people are attracted to that brand. And attracted to what it stands for. And the purpose it may give in life. And with respect to my colleague, the honourable representative from Brussels, she painted quite a dark picture of organisations. Johnson & Johnson have been there 150 years and continue to grow and continue to acquire companies and be a large organisation and do things which also benefit people. And so it's the way you manage the large organisation. But if a large organisation invests its time in both the people, in their growth and in the achievement, then they flourish. Which brings us to the third N of nurture, which is you have to nurture the organisation, just as you have to nurture an individual. So it has to have the right environment, the right conditions, and the right amount of attention, a certain amount of attention. And so this is the role of leaders, is to give organisations that right environment, to help people to flourish and grow and to prosper for the benefit of everybody, for the organisation to be successful, for the people within it to grow and develop and learn, and for society to benefit from that result. And so, yes, there will be smaller organisations. Indeed there will. There'll be small groups around. They are the feeder fish. There will always be feeder fish. Many of us in the room are feeder fish. But we need the whale to feed off of. And the whale is important. The large organisation will always be there. The monopolies and mergers commissions that exist because organisations grow. If they didn't grow and become big, you wouldn't need to stop people from being dominant. It's a natural part of human evolution, is to grow. Yeah.
Point of information. Do you have any data as opposed to opinions on this?
There's a lot of data. In fact, this data is based on research with over 1,000 executives, which was actually appeared in my last book, Care to Dare. Thank you very much. Which is...
Nice one.
Yeah. Which basically
Still
says...
pay me later.
Yeah. Which basically says that if you care about people, they will stretch and go out of their comfort zones and achieve more than they ever thought possible, which then helps an organisation achieve more than it thought possible, which will help society achieve more than it thought possible. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think am I close to my time or what? 2 minutes. So let me sum up by saying, back to the first 3 questions. Why are we here? We could have done this virtually. We could have done an internet chat room meeting for the 10th anniversary, but we didn't. A lot of us blocked our diaries, we got on planes, we packed, we cancelled other things to be here, to be together, to see each other, to be physically present. It's so fundamental to human beings to be together, to be part of something that's big, that's growing. We celebrated the fact that we have 100 members and we want to be bigger. This is good news, right? Growth is good for us. So the first question, why are we here? We're here because we're social beings. Why did we do a master's? Because we want to grow and learn and achieve. It's in our nature. We want to get better. We want to be more. And the third question, why did we choose HSC and Oxford versus some online obscure group? Well, it's around the status as well, because HSC and Oxford is an institution. It's been here years. It's lasted centuries. It has a brand. It has something worthwhile. And that's why we want to be part of it. It gives us something to be part of something bigger. So thank you. With the needs that we have as human beings, with the laws of nature, and applying nurture, large organisations will certainly continue to survive and thrive into the future. Thank you.
So thank you to our first two speakers for, I think, stunning presentations. Unless that has absolutely intimidated the entire audience into silence, we can take some questions or points that people from the floor would like to make. If there are any volunteers, of course. This one.
Can the last speaker give us an example of an organism in nature which continues to grow in size indefinitely and does not come to a natural limit, at which point it behaves differently?
Thank you very much. Okay, so, with wonderful input immediately from my colleague here, two are fungi and trees. Okay, so we just share that across. However, organisations are made up of people. They're living organisations of people. But the institution of the organisation continues long after the people who started it have passed on. And so they continue. People may die along the way, but the organisation continues and thrives. Hence, the founders of Johnson & Johnson are not around anymore. They're not 150 years, but their organisation certainly is. Does that help answer your question?
I'm afraid it doesn't.
It doesn't answer your question.
A tree, sorry, if you
Yes.
ask, Chair, the speaker asked me a question, so I'll answer it addressing the chair. And my point was that in nature, organisms come to a natural limit of their size and then cease to get bigger. They stabilize at a certain size in their life cycle.
So if I may share, no, we'll hold it till later.
I think not. Thanks.
Mr. Chairman, I was going to respond with an example a little closer to home, perhaps. We are all members of Green Templeton College. You need to study the college symbols and metaphors and the shield, which contains a nautilus. A nautilus, as I have been instructed by the college, is an animal which never ceases growing during its life.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to support my learned friend on the right. We were indeed members of Green Templeton College, and it no longer exists. It's been subsumed by Said. It's just a matter of time before Said also disappears.
Green Templeton College certainly does exist. Mick, you missed the honourable member. Missed the event in Green Templeton College, which would have shown it really does exist.
Mr. Chairman, may I as my name was quoted, I'd like to thank the honourable member from Green Templeton for calling me honourable for the first time. As far as I've known the honourable member. But I would like to say that actually Green Templeton is just a building. It's not really an organisation. The organisation has indeed been subsumed by Said. It's simply an empty shell of a 1950s and 60s relic.
I would like to know from either honourable member what is the working definition of a large organisation?
Of course. A large organisation is a collection of smaller organisations that have therefore got larger. In physics, we can start off with subatomic particles that thereby build up, and we now manifest ourselves as human beings that are composites of subatomic particles into atoms, into mitochondria, into cells, and other sorts of things. So organisations exist at many ones. But if you want to get more sort of controversial for right here, right now, we might even say human-based collectives.
Well,
As organisations attempting to achieve some sort of purpose.
Right, so are we basing this on a dollar amount that defines the organisation, or are we talking about the number of people who are involved in that organisation?
We will only use that if we need to win an argument with the other side.
Well, that's
this
Yeah.
conversation going by the chair, please. And, we're verging on the disrespectful, by the way.
Can I answer? The official definition, depending on which continent you are, is that there are small and medium-sized companies up to 500 employees, etc. Large organisations tend to be somewhere over 1,000 employees, but naturally, I mean, the larger they get, the more difficult it is to really oversee them, and the more the lack of transparency is, etc., as we've seen. So the bigger they are, the more amorphous they are, the bigger lack of transparency, the more difficult it gets. And that's really what, personally, I was talking about.
Thank you.
I would like both honourable members to elaborate on what kind of large-scale organisations are we talking about? Because according to the answers we just got, an organisation of 5,000 people, whether it be a traditionally hierarchical organised organisation, or it would be a network-based organisation with sustainable units, would kind of be the same thing from what you've been arguing so far, and I would see that it's very different whether or not we're talking about traditional organized organization or more modernly organized.
As far as I'm concerned, I'm really looking at the traditional organisation. We've said that in 15 years, large organisations, as we know them today, traditionally, will no longer exist. That means that they may morph into a different format, where you may have distributed individual workers, freelancers, self-employed people, etc. So we're really talking about the large traditional organisations. And as my learned friend from member from Switzerland said, about Johnson & Johnson, I've looked through the internet. I didn't use the stats in my speech. However, how many of the large organisations have gone under in the last 15 years? Many, many, many. Many well-known names. And it continues to happen. So Johnson & Johnson may be one of the few companies that are still here in 15 years' time. But fundamentally, we are talking about the general concept that large organisations will no longer exist as we know them today in 15 years' time.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, very briefly, just to say the motion is large organisations as they exist today. And so that encompasses all large organisations because they exist today.
Through the chair, do the honourable member see churches as organisations in this context?
Yes, is the answer from both sides.
Yes.
Is it possible that I can respond to that remark in the previous two during my presentation?
Yeah, of course.
During?
During my remark.
It is,
Of course you can, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, how do you account for the notion of the boundaryless organisation? What is in and what is out?
What is employed?
What is it?
Sorry. It's
Would
an
anyone like to
organisation.
respond to that?
Okay.
Would you like to pursue that question in other terms?
Well, I don't believe that you can really talk about traditional organisations, because I think for I don't know how many years you could consider organisations as not having boundaries, and therefore there's no kind of unit, as it were. So how can you say they're big or small? It depends what you include in them or don't.
I would have to assume that the motion doesn't accept that definition of an organisation, that it can be boundaryless.
I do support the question from Honourable Member from Paris. Organizations nowadays are defined as without boundaries. They're defined as including stakeholders, that is clients, that is agents, that is resellers, that is many other person, not only the person holding the badge and holding the brand. So I do support her question.
Support the
It's
question.
not just a question of employment contracts. You can include the suppliers in it, you can include whatever.
Well,
So I'm a member of, I'm part of the organisation of, was it atoday.co.uk, along with many, many organisations I belong to, depending on my toilet paper, my Kleenex tissues, my breakfast cereal, and everything else I purchase since I'm a client.
I would like to support what you say in terms of organisational belonging. We have our football teams, for example. So if you are a supporter, we have some strong supporters in the room of football teams or rugby teams. If you're a supporter of a football team, you're not actually employed by that football team, but the army of supporters is huge, and there's a sense of belonging and a sense of achievement that is drawn from being associated with and being part of that collective.
Mr. Chair, for any of the speakers, up till now we've been talking about what will happen with these organizations. Is descriptive. But can the speakers address what should happen?
With respect, I believe that's a different motion.
What did Martin say? If I could say briefly, what I think we heard from the Honourable Speaker from Brussels was the results focus only. Whereas what we see is the benefit of what is when people focus on both the people side as well as results. Start with the people and through them achieve the results. Then we will see organisations thrive even further and fulfil their potential.
With all due respect to the honourable member from Switzerland, actually I didn't talk about the results at all. I talked about the here and now and why it is unsustainable. I made absolutely no commitment to what should or might it look like in the future.
We do have time for one or two more questions.
Am I allowed to respond to that point?
You are, if you wish.
Yes, thank you, my honourable colleague from Brussels. I would just, as a point of information, reiterate what you stated, that you kind of predicted the future of a future collapse. Definitely something bigger than 2008. So you did try to look into the future in the next 15 years.
I did not look specifically to the future of individual organisations or what they might look like. I simply said, according to the motion, Mr. Chairman, that they will no longer exist as they are today and why they will no longer exist as they are today. Because it is unsustainable.
Yes, and I would add and finish your thought that and will lead to a collapse bigger than 2008 was the statement.
Are there any other questions from the floor? Then it falls to me to ask our second speaker for the motion, the Honourable Member of Green Templeton College from Singapore, to take the floor. Microphone.
Let me first thank the Honourable House for being here tonight and being prepared to put their time and great intellectual capacities to this very important question before us. The Honourable Chairman for organising this, and the right Honourable members who are in support and sadly off path on the other side of the chamber. The motion before us is in the next 15 years, that's a time-bound equation, large organizations which we're prepared for the point of discussion to say 1,000 people up, which does include the Catholic Church, includes the Buddhist Church. In fact, it probably includes Oxford as well. As we know them, a critical part of the statement, because in any proposition one has to consider the whole, will no longer exist. Now, firstly, as we get into this, I must thank the right honourable member from Switzerland for so wonderfully and beautifully supporting us in the proposition that large organizations will continue to exist, but possibly not as we know them. With a little bit more love and leadership, they'll be far better places, is the way she spoke about it. And as a human being, I have to admit, I have a lot of sympathy for this particular position. Now, the Right Honourable Member from Brussels, which we must know they're in a similar sort of time zone and social structure, so it was wonderful to see the way the arguments came together, focused on the fact that our world has already a level of chaos and change automatically happening with it, and therefore large organizations as we know them today will not exist in 15 years. She put forward several propositions. Now I'm going to bring them forward and focus on several particular items. Now, how many of you in this particular assembly were part of the Oxford and HEC coaching or consulting and coaching for change program? I love it when everyone agrees. That's superb. And those of you who weren't have been visitors, so we appreciate your presence here too. Now, in that program, one of the key things we had put forward to us was that there are multiple lenses and viewpoints. So we're going to cover several different lenses and viewpoints that will establish very firmly why large organizations, as we know them today, will not exist as they are in 15 years. Firstly, organizations have this continual thing called staff turnover, which therefore means in 15 years they will not have the same set of people in them. It's a fact. Think of it as cellular renewal at the organizational level. It's actually very fundamental, because the changes of different people coming in bring different belief systems, different challenges. That's just within the organization, much less before we even go outside. A question: how many members in this particular chamber have held their current position for 15 years? Hands up, anyone who's done it for over 15 years. Excellent, a resounding result. We have a few who are putting their hands down almost in embarrassment, which I think is tragic. Because it demonstrates that even in organizations that last, there's only very few people who do stay through any particular period. And the mere fact that there are some people here who have been in those organizations for over 15 years supports the proposition that the rest have changed. And therefore the organizations that even they are in, which are older than 15 years, are probably not identical to what they were then. So I feel it's a fairly sound proposition to put forward that in 15 years those organizations will be somewhat different, because some of your colleagues may have changed, even if you have chosen not to. You may have changed at a personal level, and I would suggest that given the body renews itself, and depending on the particular level of the biology, in 7 years or under, that even you physically probably will have renewed yourself and therefore be slightly different. I am not going to touch the subject of aging.
Good.
We hold that in rebuttal for later. Secondly, we had an amazing session this morning with Chris McKenna, who showed how industry is continuously changing and therefore organizations as a natural response will change. The Right Honourable Member from Switzerland pointed out that organizations have a biological type response system. Thank you very much for your contributions to our debate. And therefore, as any good responsive system, thank you also to our earlier program where we heard about complex adaptive systems, organizations will adapt and respond, and therefore in 15 years cannot be the identical thing they are today, because the world around them is different and they too will be responding differently. So very much thanks to Chris. Now, the next one. It was delicately put, but I would put to this particular group that most of us are over the age of 30. And I would even be incredibly courageous and say that the vast majority are over the age of 40. And potentially even a decade or two beyond that. Now, on a transgenerational politics side of things, I know we don't like to talk about it in this part of the world, but I live in a part of the world where the younger generation outnumber the older generation. And it's not an unreasonable thing to suggest that the things that what the Right Honourable Member from Hong Kong and China mentioned this afternoon, that the shifts in the generational divide and capacity to support older generations versus younger generations will change the way we look at things. We're seeing that in the legal systems in Asia. What was spoken about happening in China exists likewise in Singapore. The younger generation is expected to financially support the older generation, not through taxes, but if they're your parents, 10% of your income, thank you very much.
that will change the responsibilities that individuals have. It'll also lead to different types of structures between those who have jobs, those who are lucky enough to have a 0-hour job, which I find a fascinating structure, and those who have other sorts of things. So the generational shifts that we're seeing going on in demographics will naturally play out over the next 15 years. I'm not making any predictions majorly how it will happen. I'm curious. I know I'm on the slightly older side of the generational thing, but I look, as the Right Honourable Chairman asked us to do today, at what the younger generations will think of us. And I suspect there'll be some things that will change in 15 years. So organizations will change from that too. Secondly, or thirdly or fourthly by now, the evolutions of the companies. Have any of you noticed that company structures have changed over the years? Quite possibly. Organizations exist as legal entities for a particular reason. They've got the veil of incorporation to protect them. Some of those particular rights and obligations are changing. There's been a social interplay of whether organizations and shareholders have preeminence or whether the stakeholder structure has preeminence. That interplay continues to unfold, and if we look at some of the more general things happening, one might, if one was a betting person, suggest that the stakeholder argument might outweigh the shareholder argument over the next 15 years. Again, changing the way that organizations, particularly large ones, respond to the providers of capital and to other stakeholders, to the questions of the boundaryless organization in very different ways to the way that they do today. So again, large organizations as we know them today may no longer exist in their current forms. Of course, it would be very sad in Oxford not to touch on philosophy. There's that wonderful, and anyone who can provide the quote would be gratefully appreciated, about no one being able to cross the same river twice. I think we touched on that earlier. They will not be able to be the same. Now, lastly, at a somewhat bigger sphere, it was put forward that large organizations might not actually exist, whereas the actual proposition is they won't exist as we know them today. One of the interesting things that you see in biology to the question of things getting larger and larger is that organizational structures may often start with a decomposition, but structurally start with also go through phases of recomposing and growing into larger and larger scales. For those of you who might have spent some time in Asia and the whole Buddhist mentality, they would see it as a natural reconnection with the whole, and we would submit that even if there's a devolution and splitting up of organizations, there is also a process by which people and organizations reconnect and create larger collectives and groups and motions. We can see that in this community here, and the number of people that have come from different parts of the world with different viewpoints for over 10 years now. We can see it in the way that we communicate with many, many people from different places and parts of the world and different times. So the structure of organizations isn't the same as it was when we started this program 10 years ago. The structure, the way we think, is different. The structure that allowed the book that we so proudly produced in this house was totally enabled by technologies that didn't exist 10 years ago. And it allowed a collaboration and a creation as an organization that admittedly is not large by the definition of 1,000, but nonetheless is changing the way that we can operate and exist. So I put it to the group and to the community that large organizations as we know them will not exist in the current form in 15 years.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. I just wish to bring up the fact that it seemed to me that this motion, if it's simply focusing on the fact that organizations are changing, we know that they're changing. We're educated to know that we're changing. Things are changing all the time. Any organism is constantly changing. I would like to mention that I feel that this would be simply merely quibbling. My understanding of the motion is that organizations tend to grow, and that they will grow and they will continue to grow, and that they have grown in the past, and that they continue to grow through the present. Organizations such as Exxon, which have become ExxonMobil, IBM, Nestle, Roche, they continue to grow. Banks have gotten continuously bigger, UBS, Credit Suisse, and the fact that there are regulatory authorities that try to limit or examine mergers and acquisitions and monopolies is proof that the tendency, the natural tendency, is for organizations to grow and to grow larger and bigger. The same thing with respect to metropoli. Cities are growing. So organizations have this tendency to grow, and that was my understanding of the motion.
Point of order.
Here.
It's not a question, it's not a point of information.
I found it very informative. Thank you.
I would only say that I think it falls to the speakers to interpret the motion in the way that they see fit and argue those points for themselves. But I understand that the substance of the point that you make. I don't think I can address it. I think the speakers have to address it. Which means that we're now into our last speaker, and it falls to me to invite the Honourable Member of Green Templeton College from the Pittsburgh constituency to take the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, change leaders. Against all experiential evidence, our honorable speakers have painted an incomplete picture of exploding organizations, leaving out a vital half or even more of the story of imploding organizations when they advocate in favor of the proposition. In my remarks, I'll try to answer the comment here and a number of the remarks along the way. As our example, and with our example, let's look into a case cited as a story of transformation, a large success, the most innovative city of the past, which is now the most livable city in the United States in 8 different surveys over the past 20 years. This should be a great story of success and would be a test case, not of looking only at the failures, but at the success. Does this proposition hold up or not? And my claim is not in the way that you think it does. All right. It is a double success in the sense it is the anti-Detroit. And here we should find abundant exploding and creation of new organizational forms. Instead, we find the opposite even in the best success story. Imploding organizations have left minimal, indeed, destructive legacies. All right, let's use organizations of the type that the change leaders are quite familiar with. Fortune 500 companies. They won't be quite boundaryless as we're expanding now. They won't include churches per se, but at the end I will refer to them. They won't have a precise number for the honorable member from Denmark. But in such corporations, in this example, we can expect a large organization to be more than 10,000 people. We can expect such an organization to perhaps be bounded by our honorable member who's written in our book of organizations around 100,000 or size. So we're talking about large corporations, 10 to 100,000 people. All right. It doesn't leave it as amorphous as our honorable colleagues would have it. The corporations are more defined. And I would say it is a Kodak moment for the large organization. Imploding, destruction in the wake of imploding does not a pretty picture make. We will agree that this half-formed proposition is not deserving of our full support, and we will vote no to the proposition by the time I finish. I grew up in the shadow of a giant industrial bakery. This was Nabisco with the smell of Chips Ahoy wafting across my school days, and the smell of saltines in the days of my childhood when the economy was not doing as well. During the downturns, KKR shuttered Nabisco's highest quality bakery when its misleveraged numbers did not add up. This sent the Italian-American and African-American neighborhood around it into a tailspin for which it has never recovered. We're talking about poverty, massive outmigration, drug addiction, crime, shootings unabated, everything going through the roof. All right, this is a story that has been repeated again and again in Pittsburgh. When in Larimer, the bakery, in Homestead, in East Liberty, in Rankin, in Braddock, in McKeesport, in Duquesne, in Ambridge, in Aliquippa, in Donora and Monessen. When, for example, and I'm giving you the whole corporate story here, I'm not selecting certain cases. Beazer cut coppers to shreds like an expired credit card. When Chevron drowned Gulf Oil, the headquarters skyscraper is still empty. When Westinghouse Electric hired the Pepsi chairman, and the thing has disappeared. When J&L Steel was sold for scrap. When the Revaux shipbuilding was scuppered. And by the way, this changed with millions of dollars in consultants of the kind that we like to consider ourselves. Corporations do not explode commonly into newer forms, they implode. Corporations do not yield life forms. They blunder on until death. They yield usually carcasses. And corporations collapse. Our friends, our esteemed colleagues would have us believe that to look at the organizational future, we need to look at demographic change outside the organization. I think that's not quite on target with incremental cell replacement. We are talking about, to support one of the speakers from Switzerland, we are talking about large organizational change and dramatic change. In this case, we had 300,000 people depart, leaving river towns as zones of desolation. Deaths by drug overdose are concentrated in these areas. 10,000 shootings since then have occurred largely in those areas. Tens of thousands of people have died early. Uncounted numbers have died alone. So our friends are speaking about decomposition and recomposition kind of like a compost pile. But I think we ought to look at humans and the effect of collapsing organizations. Should any corporation survive, they follow the old pattern. There's no new pattern here. They centralize. They move the headquarters to New York. Alcoa, Mellon Bank, now Bank of New York Mellon, Nabisco, and many others. In this hemisphere, from South Africa through Europe, they're fleeing to London. They're centralizing, not creating new organizations. All right, where they can here they ride reinvigorated cash flow into the future wall of extinction. The story continues this year in Pittsburgh. Modernizing the steel company with enterprise resource software has failed at a cost of hundreds of millions of dollars. It's the kind of board and CEO failure that my esteemed colleague has written about in chapter 7 of this must-read book. Let's see, this is a company without profit for the last 5 years, United States Steel. This year in Pittsburgh, America's second richest man bought the world's third largest food company. This is centralization, not exploding. The CEO who mismanaged the place, a 25% discount in value, was fired, of course. And his golden parachute is equal to about 3,000 years of salaries for the 2,296 people who were laid off. This is not evolution. This is not what we're hoping of exploding. This is just skate into the wall and cut. All right. So just summing with the corporate rush to failure is not exploding. Again, I think we might have veered off the topic when my esteemed colleague talked about board evolution, possibly dealing with some of these things in an incremental way, while making the case that that will be a different organization that exists now. But what about growing new companies? Let me go away from the corporates. Could we have new companies coming up? What about technology? Meds and eds, the modern saviors of the modern city, which have made Pittsburgh the most livable. We have 4 systems that built the internet on the asynchronous transfer mode switch. Respironics and MedRad. These are medical equipment pioneers. Free markets, internet, commodities, commerce. And we have Vivissimo, a big data search engine. All of these fast-growing companies have been taken over by GE Marconi, if you remember that company, right? It's gone. Siemens and Philips, SAP, have taken over the others. And these are organizations that actually cap and decap companies. They cap the development and freeze them in place when they take over. They decap the leadership, no matter how deserving it was being fired or undeserving. And so we see that new companies are coming, nothing is coming up that can get to this scale again. So again, we have not exploding but imploding. This is quite different than what our half-achieved proposition says. Yes, please.
So where do you put companies like Microsoft and Google who may have just come up relatively recently and be somewhat large?
If we had 15 minutes or more, we would look at large companies such as Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and others that are trying to chew margin off the sides of big markets, such as shopping, by doing it faster through the internet. But we don't have a moment for that. But those may adhere to this model, and I appreciate the point of information. They may adhere to the model of just continuing along riding that cash stream until hitting the wall. Time is to be seen. Yahoo, as an example, is several years ahead of the others in hitting the wall. But I very much appreciate the inquiry. Vivissimo, I will say, is the exception. This big data company joined IBM's Big Data Group this year. If you can make the case that the average of corporate management will rise to the level of IBM, please consider voting yes for the proposition. All right, so cap and decap is not exploding, only imploding. Accelerating the cash stream into an eventual wall does not leave behind other organizations or the seed pods of our imaginations. Now, why does this idea that imploding needs to join exploding even matter to us? How am I doing in time? Yep, come to, okay, thank you. I was fortunate this week to see the Magna Carta in Salisbury. 40 score years ago, and the words are still relevant. And I would encourage the change leaders, our group, when we get the words right and the ideas right, the ideas carry power. And I would push us to come up with the right words to reflect those ideas. All right. Let me just conclude, please, that the Nabisco story does come around. 30 years later, after being one of the diaspora of explosion, I returned to Pittsburgh to find a newly renovated giant Nabisco bakery. LEED Platinum certified with Google regional headquarters, 500 software engineers inside, and a little bakery in the ground floor. And when I climbed to the top of the tower, I can look 360 degrees around me. I count 65 institutional rooftops poking through Pittsburgh's green canopy. They all have changed in those 30 years. All of the synagogues are gone. One of them is a charter school. All of the Catholic churches and schools lie empty and shuttered. Old schools, public schools, have become senior centers. One church is a community center. There's institutional change all around us of a different kind that is not really considered in this proposition. It's not where the change leaders are looking. So my encouragement to us is that people are adapting much more than we give them credit for. And we ought to put our words and our ideas in the direction of where people really are, not only the large institutions as we conceive them. Thank you.
Yes?
I find it honorable chairman. I find
I'm glad you do find it.
And my honorary colleagues from the Green Templeton College. I find it very difficult to cast my vote because I hear both groups saying that there is an evolution going on. So never mind what we see today. The companies in the organizations in 50 years' time will be anyway developed. So could you please help me to see the real difference between the different opinions?
What I can help you with is to read out once again the motion that's before the House.
But I can't hear it from the...
This House believes that in the next 15 years, large organisations, as we know them, will no longer exist.
Yes, that is what the proposition was on the table, but I can't hear from the honourable members' discussions very big difference in their opinion.
I think that's rather unfortunate. But it's a perfectly reasonable situation to get to, given the motion that was before the House. I can take 2 questions only now before we come to a division.
So, Mr. Chairman, you very kindly mentioned at the beginning those of the honourable audience that are not native English speakers. Being one of them, and also coming from a country where the habits of debate are somewhat different, I would like to thank you very much, Mr. President, and the honourable speakers, and the honourable organisers of this debate, for giving us the opportunity to experience this delightful piece of British culture.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Could I try to clarify the motion? Because as it is stated, it is large organizations as we know them will cease to exist. Now, is it a reasonable interpretation to translate that as no large organizations will exist? In other words, the motion states that in 15 years' time there will be no large organizations. Now, clearly, we only have the words in front of you, but perhaps yourself as chairman could assist the House in an interpretation.
Could I add to that?
He didn't say yes yet.
What the motion really is, that all large organizations that exist today as we know them will not exist in the same form in 15 years' time. So you're including all organizations that exist in the form they exist now, large organizations, will not exist in the same form. And I put it to you that in the 15-year time scale, there will be some organizations that exist now in the form they exist, will continue to exist in 15 years time.
Okay, I will try and clarify the point only insofar as to say that the wording of this motion was pored over long and hard. And we did have the possibility of putting clarifying words within that would have answered, perhaps, depending on which word we chose, some of your uncertainties. We chose not to do that, and so as a consequence, I think I would assume that every honourable member that's now got the opportunity to vote must interpret this in their own way and not in a very tightly defined way, because I think we've not defined the motion in a tightly defined way. We've left it with a good deal of ambiguity. So I think we've got to the time at which we need you to take your vote on the motion, which I'll read again. This House proposes that in the next 15 years, large organisations, as we know them, will no longer exist. Those in favour of that motion should direct themselves towards this side of the House, please. The speakers congregate around here. And those that are against, please congregate to this side of the House. And those that don't wish to vote can stay in their seats.
They will exist here, they won't exist there.
I'm a cheap win. Code 4, you know where your lawyer is.
Where you going?
I'm honest when I say it. I can't really hear the disability.
No, I agree.
An organisation that is
Actually, yes, I'm with you on this. Let's see where the vote goes, and let's go to the other side.
Since it's linked
Now we're going to get into a difficult situation.
Very conservative. Yeah.
I'll buy you a beer.
Order! That's very unconstitutional behaviour.
Bloody hell, this is close. We're actually have to count this.
Well, we have an independent teller here of expert proportions.
Just I think I'm 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
99. Oh, you got to count me over there, by the way, Gavin. I think it's more. It's more here, actually.
You confused me. 69. People will move around here.
I think by something like 27 to 24, the nays have it.
The nays have it. And now, thank you very much, all of you. Can I just ask you to have a round of applause for all of the speakers?